Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't have much, but they knew how to survive when things got hard. They had simple tricks that helped them stay alive without money or machines. Most of those tricks are long forgotten, but they still work today if you ever need them. Medieval peasants couldn't afford metal pots, so they got creative with rocks. They heated stones in a fire until red hot, then dropped them into wooden bowls, leather bags, or clay-lined holes filled with water. The water boiled just as well as in a metal pot, perfect for cooking and making water safe to drink. With a little patience and the right tools, meaning hot rocks and something that wouldn't catch fire, dinner was served. The trick was probably discovered by accident when someone dropped a hot stone into their drinking water and noticed it started bubbling like a medieval jacuzzi. It wasn't science, it was survival mixed with a dash of curiosity. And once it worked, you can bet word spread fast among neighbors desperate for any reliable cooking method. But not just any rock worked. River rocks were forbidden because they contained water inside and would explode when heated. Nobody wanted to explain to their spouse why there were rock chunks embedded in dinner. Those kinds of surprises could ruin a meal and a marriage. The best stones were dry, solid rocks from higher ground. Granite worked perfectly. It handled the heat without shattering, and it didn't sneak moisture bombs into the fire. Smart peasants collected good boiling stones and reused them repeatedly. Once you found a few reliable ones, you guarded them like treasure. This method was especially common in areas where iron was scarce and remained popular well into the 1800s. Medieval people might not have understood germs, but they figured out that boiled water somehow kept fewer people from getting the runs. Trial and error taught them that clear water didn't always mean safe water, but bubbling it with a few fire-roasted stones seemed to do the trick. Of course, medieval peasants had many other clever cooking tricks up their sleeves. Medieval peasants turned dirt into an effective cooking tool. Fresh clay was mixed with water until it reached mud consistency, then used to completely coat fish, chicken, rabbit, or any other meat. The clay-wrapped bundle went straight onto hot coals, creating a sealed cooking chamber as the clay hardened from heat. No pot, no pan, just earth, fire, and a good eye for doneness. The process was so simple that even the village fool could master it, which was fortunate since he usually volunteered to test the first batch. With little more than a pile of mud and something edible, even the most inexperienced cook could serve up a meal that tasted like it came from a castle kitchen. When cooking finished, they simply cracked open the hardened shell. Here's the clever part. When the clay was peeled away, it took all the fur, feathers, or fish scales with it. No plucking chickens or scaling fish required. It was like having a medieval sous chef made of mud. Prep time? Practically eliminated. This method produced incredibly tender, flavorful meat because natural juices stayed locked inside. The meat came out so moist, it practically fell off the bone. The sealed clay shell acted like a slow cooker, trapping steam and flavor better than any metal pot could. Clay cooking worked for vegetables too. Root vegetables cooked beautifully this way, their flavors deepened by the gentle, even heat. The technique required the right type of clay. Pure enough not to crack when heated, but sticky enough to form a solid shell. If the mix was wrong, it would fall apart or let in ash. Some families got so good at clay cooking that their neighbors started placing orders like it was medieval takeout. Word spread fast when your dinner came wrapped in dirt and tasted like heaven. But clay cooking was just one of several food preservation methods peasants mastered. Salt was worth its weight in gold during medieval times, and peasants treated it like the precious resource it was. Some people literally worked for salt instead of money, which explains why we still say someone earns their salt when they do good work. Salt wasn't just seasoning back then, it was survival packed in crystal form. The salt preservation method was devastatingly effective against bacteria that spoiled meat. Salt draws moisture from food through osmosis, and without moisture, harmful bacteria cannot survive and multiply. This method didn't just slow down decay, it practically froze time for meat. Large wooden barrels became the refrigerators of the medieval world, stacked in cool storage areas, sometimes buried halfway underground for extra temperature control. Peasants would layer salt and meat in alternating patterns, making sure every piece of meat was completely surrounded by salt. It was an art as much as a necessity. A single pig could feed a family through winter, assuming nobody got too hungry the first week and ate all the good parts. The salt crust would eventually harden around the meat like armor. Tough to break, but worth the effort when fresh meat was months away. The salt had to be the right type. Coarse sea salt worked best because it drew moisture more effectively than fine salt. Rock salt was used too, depending on what was available. Communities often shared salt storage facilities since individual families couldn't afford enough salt for their own barrels. Some villages even formed salt cooperatives, where families pooled resources to preserve meat collectively. Entire wars were fought over salt sources, proving that even in medieval times, people took their food preservation seriously. Properly salted meat could last 6 months or longer without spoiling, actually improving with age like modern cured meats. The taste changed over time, becoming richer and more intense. Not bad for something that started out as a survival tactic. However, salt wasn't the only preservation method. Medieval peasants turned their homes into giant smokehouses. Walking into one of their houses was basically like stepping into a barbecue restaurant, only without the fancy decor. The smell of smoky meat hung in the air all year round, so guests probably felt right at home, or at least knew dinner was coming soon. Small huts, attics, or even specially built loft spaces were converted into dedicated smoking chambers where the magic happened. The process was simple but required serious patience and skill. Wood fires were kept burning at low temperatures to produce steady streams of smoke rather than high heat that would cook the meat too quickly. Different types of wood produced different flavors, and peasants learned which woods worked best for certain meats. Oak was prized for its mild, sweet smoke that added subtle flavor without overpowering the meat. Hickory, on the other hand, gave a stronger, more robust taste that packed a punch and could stand up to fattier cuts. Indoor smoking served multiple purposes. It preserved food for long winters, added rich flavor, kept bugs and flies away, and even gave families something interesting to talk about when visitors dropped by. The smoking process wasn't a quick fix. Larger pieces of meat could take days or even weeks hanging in the smokehouse, slowly soaking up flavor and drying just enough to keep safe. Properly smoked meat developed a dark, protective crust on the outside while staying tender and juicy inside. This crust acted like natural packaging, shielding the meat from insects, bacteria, and moisture. Some smoked meats could last for months without needing any other preservation method, making it a medieval multitasker of food safety. It was like having a medieval bug zapper that also made your food taste better. Families developed their own secret smoking techniques passed down through generations, a blend of fire management, wood choice, and timing that turned simple meat into a prized delicacy. While smoking preserved meat above ground, peasants also developed underground storage solutions. Medieval peasants basically invented the world's first natural refrigerators by digging holes in the ground. The best part? These cellars never needed repairs, never broke down, and never required arguing with customer service representatives. No monthly bills, no power outages, just pure, reliable cold storage powered by the earth itself. The secret was digging below the frost line, the depth where ground temperatures stay constant year-round, unaffected by summer heat or winter freezes. In most areas, this meant going down at least 4 feet, sometimes deeper depending on the soil and climate. At this depth, temperatures remain steady between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for slowing down spoilage without freezing the food solid. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, potatoes, and onions could last for months in these underground chambers. But the cellars weren't just for veggies. Peasants also stored butter, cheese, and milk down there to keep them cool and fresh. Some even tucked away jars of homemade preserves and cured meats, making these holes in the ground vital to surviving the long winter. Construction was surprisingly sophisticated. The walls were often lined with carefully stacked stones to prevent cave-ins and keep the cellar sturdy through wet seasons. The floors were covered with sand or gravel for drainage, stopping excess moisture from pooling and ruining the stored food. Some families became so skilled at cellar building that their neighbors started hiring them to create storage spaces, making these peasants the medieval equivalent of custom closet installers. Many root cellars were cleverly built into hillsides, which made digging easier and provided natural insulation on 3 sides. This design kept temperatures even more consistent and protected the cellars from harsh winds. The best root cellars could keep food fresh from the fall harvest all the way through spring planting season, often meaning the difference between a comfortable winter and spending February gnawing on tree bark and leftover scraps. These underground refrigerators were a simple but brilliant solution. Nature's own cold storage, reliable and free, showing once again how medieval peasants made the most of what they had. Storage was important, but peasants also needed reliable water sources throughout the year. Medieval peasants became surprisingly skilled at capturing rain, effectively turning their roofs into makeshift water collection systems. Since reliable water delivery was often a luxury far beyond their reach, they adapted their thatched roofs to channel rainwater into barrels using simple grooves and crude gutters fashioned from split logs or shaped stone. The barrels themselves were carefully sealed to keep the collected water clean and, importantly, to prevent mosquitoes from breeding inside. To improve the water's quality, simple filters made from layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth were used to remove dirt and debris, and even to help improve taste. While not perfect by modern standards, this system was far better than drinking directly from animal-filled streams nearby. Barrel placement was a matter of strategy. Peasants arranged them to catch water from multiple roof sections, maximizing their collection. Some households maintained networks of 5 or 6 barrels, providing a surprisingly large reserve of water. During dry spells, this stored rainwater could last for weeks, giving families a crucial buffer. Ironically, rainwater was often the cleanest water source available. To keep the water cooler and protect it from freezing in colder months, some barrels were partially buried underground. This also helped maintain freshness. Rainwater was generally less contaminated than stream or well water, which could be affected by runoff carrying animal waste and other pollutants. Overall, this clever rain harvesting method was a lifeline, demonstrating how peasants made the most of their environment to solve everyday problems. However, having clean water was just the beginning. Peasants also needed effective remedies when illness struck. Medieval peasants discovered natural antibiotics long before anyone knew what bacteria were. Onions and garlic were their aspirin, effective, tear-inducing, and guaranteed to make you smell like you'd been fighting a roast. They believed sliced onions could pull sickness from the air. While the science behind that idea wasn't quite right, they weren't far off. Onions contain sulfur compounds that actually do kill airborne bacteria. Keeping bowls of cut onions in sick rooms may have smelled awful, but it genuinely helped stop the spread of illness. Garlic was treated like a miracle cure. Crushed garlic was rubbed directly on wounds to prevent infection. Peasants didn't know about allicin, the powerful antimicrobial compound in garlic, but they noticed wounds healed better when garlic was involved. That was proof enough. For coughs and sore throats, onion syrup mixed with honey was a go-to remedy. It tasted about as bad as it sounds, but it worked. Honey killed bacteria, onions helped reduce swelling and mucus, and together they made a medicine cabinet out of your garden. These cures were cheap, easy to grow, and often more reliable than expensive treatments from traveling healers. Some people even wore garlic around their necks to prevent illness. It wasn't exactly effective, but it did keep people at a distance, maybe even germs by accident. These natural remedies work so well, many of them are still used today. The peasants may not have known the science, but they knew the results when they saw them. But medical remedies weren't the only clever applications for common plants. Medieval peasants learned that the same spices that made food tastier could also repel pests. Rats and mice had sensitive palates. Spicy food was a no-go even for them. They sprinkled chili powder, black pepper, mustard, and horseradish around food storage, pantries, and shelves. The strong compounds in these spices created barriers pests avoided. A mouse crossing cayenne was like eating straight hot sauce. Doable, but not worth it. Spices were often mixed with ash or vinegar for extra strength and worked on bugs too, especially in grain storage. Different pests hated different spices. Mice disliked black pepper, rats avoided mustard. It was cheap, safe, and effective, since most families already had these spices. Some even grew hot peppers just for pest control, easy to grow, plentiful, and perfect for grinding into deterrent powder. While spices created barriers against pests, peasants also developed more aggressive physical methods to protect their food from larger threats. Medieval peasants turned stinging nettles into a natural security system. Like barbed wire with a built-in alarm, nettles protected food without cost or setup. They'd wrap meat or cheese in cloth, surround it with fresh nettles, and hang the bundle from beams, trees, or poles. Nettles cause a painful sting, and most animals quickly gave up trying to reach the food. Hanging food served double duty, keeping it off the ground and shielding it from climbers like birds or squirrels. It was a self-defending food fortress. Some added bells, bones, or gourds to make noise if disturbed, warning the family of intruders. Nettles were free, renewable, and later edible, making them a practical, multi-use plant. Bundles were hung high enough to stop animals, but low enough for people to reach. However, when food became truly scarce, peasants had to find creative ways to stretch their supplies using ingredients that modern people would never consider edible. When times got really tough, medieval peasants discovered that trees could provide more than just wood and shelter. They could also provide food. Bark bread might sound like something you'd feed to prisoners, but it actually kept entire communities alive during the worst famines. The inner bark of birch and pine trees was the key ingredient. This layer, called cambium, contained sugars and nutrients that the tree uses to transport food between roots and leaves. It was basically tree food that humans could also digest, though it certainly didn't taste like anything you'd find in a modern bakery. Harvesting bark required careful technique to avoid killing the trees. Peasants would peel strips of outer bark to expose the inner layer, then carefully scrape away the cambium without damaging the tree's vital systems. The preparation process was time-consuming but essential. The fresh cambium was bitter and tough, so it had to be dried thoroughly before grinding. Once dried, the bark was ground into a coarse flour and mixed with regular grain flour to make bread dough. During severe famines, bark flour could make up 1/3 or more of the bread mixture, turning every loaf into a survival ration. The resulting bread was dense, chewy, and had a distinctly bitter taste that took some getting used to. Children often complained about bark bread, but parents reminded them that complaining about food was a luxury they couldn't afford during famine years. Different trees produced different flavors and nutritional values. Birch bark flour was considered the most palatable, while pine bark contained higher levels of vitamin C. Some families developed techniques to improve the taste by adding honey, animal fat, or dried berries. While bark bread provided emergency nutrition, peasants also created beverages that could boost both health and morale during difficult times. Medieval peasants discovered that some of the most annoying weeds in their gardens could be transformed into beverages that were both nutritious and surprisingly enjoyable. They figured out that if life was going to give them weeds, they might as well ferment them into something that made the hard times a little more bearable. Nettle beer was created by boiling fresh, stinging nettles with water, then adding whatever sweeteners were available: honey, tree sap, or dried fruits. Wild yeast from the air or saved yeast from previous batches would start the fermentation process. The same nettles that stung you while weeding the garden could later help you forget about the pain. The brewing process took patience and careful attention. The nettle mixture had to be boiled long enough to extract the nutrients, but not so long that it became bitter. After cooling, the liquid was transferred to wooden barrels or clay pots where fermentation could begin. Dandelion wine followed a similar process, but used the bright yellow flowers instead of leaves. Dandelions were so common that even the poorest families could gather enough flowers to make several batches of wine. Both beverages were deliberately kept at low alcohol levels, just enough to preserve the liquid and provide mild relaxation, but not enough to create serious drinking problems. These were practical solutions to the challenges of medieval life. The nutritional benefits were significant. Nettles are incredibly rich in vitamins and minerals, including iron, vitamin C, and calcium. Dandelions contain vitamin A, potassium, and other nutrients that were often lacking in medieval diets. Drinking these herbal beverages was like taking medieval multivitamins, except they actually tasted good. Different families developed their own recipes and techniques. Some added other herbs like mint or sage for flavor, while others experimented with different sweeteners. Both beverages could be stored for months without spoiling. Of course, staying warm and comfortable during harsh winters required more than just good beverages. Medieval peasants turned agricultural waste into surprisingly effective bedding and insulation systems that kept families warm through the coldest winters. With no central heating and limited supplies, they had to get creative with whatever was lying around. They discovered that what looked like trash to wealthy people was actually premium comfort material for anyone clever enough to use it properly. Straw-filled mattresses were the foundation of medieval sleep comfort. Large cloth sacks were stuffed with clean, dry straw and sewn shut to create mattresses that were both soft and insulating. The straw provided cushioning while trapping air that acted as natural insulation, basically creating medieval memory foam, except it actually helped you remember what a good night's sleep felt like. These mattresses didn't just make sleeping bearable, they kept families off the cold ground and a little closer to warmth. Family sleeping arrangements were designed for maximum warmth efficiency. Multiple family members would share beds, arranged head to toe to make the most of available space and body heat. This sleeping arrangement required some negotiation about who had to deal with whose feet, but it was remarkably effective at keeping everyone warm. In small homes, it was one of the few ways to survive frigid winter nights. Heated stones became medieval hot water bottles. Large stones were heated by the fire, wrapped in rags or cloth, and tucked under blankets before bedtime. These stone heaters could keep a bed warm for hours, though care had to be taken to avoid burns. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it beat freezing. Window and door insulation was achieved through strategic placement of thick cloths and tapestries. Heavy fabrics were hung over openings to create additional barriers against cold air. The quality of straw made a significant difference in comfort levels. Fresh, clean straw from wheat or barley was preferred. Smart families had a rotation system where old straw was composted for garden use, while fresh straw was prepared for bedding. Multiple layers of insulation were used throughout the house to create smaller, more easily heated spaces within larger rooms. Every bit of warmth was preserved and nothing was wasted, not even the straw under your back. But staying warm required more than just good bedding. Peasants also had to find reliable fuel sources for heating. Medieval peasants discovered that some of the best fuel for heating and cooking came from the business end of their livestock. In a time when forests weren't always nearby and wood was too valuable to waste on daily fires, people had to get creative. They figured out that what goes in one end of a cow comes out the other end as premium heating material. Though the marketing department definitely could have used some work, it may not have sounded glamorous, but when the temperatures dropped and the firewood ran low, dung became a dependable lifesaver. Cow and horse dung were the preferred materials because they burned slowly and produced steady heat. Unlike twigs or straw, which vanished in a flash, dried dung gave off a long, consistent burn. The dung was collected fresh, then shaped into flat patties and left to dry in the sun. These fuel cakes became a familiar sight near peasant homes, carefully laid out in rows like awkward little pancakes. The drying process was crucial. Wet dung would just smolder and smoke, while properly dried dung burned cleanly with minimal odor. If done right, you could light a fire without filling the house with choking fumes. The drying process required careful timing and weather awareness. You couldn't just slap dung on the ground and hope for the best. Dung patties were arranged on flat surfaces where they could get maximum sun exposure while being protected from rain. Some families built raised drying platforms or used large flat stones to catch and reflect heat. Families became expert weather predictors because nobody wanted their winter fuel supply to get rained on. A single unexpected shower could ruin weeks' worth of work, turning fuel into a soggy, useless mess. Storage was just as important as preparation. Once the dung was dry, it had to be protected from moisture and animals. Dried dung was stacked in sheds, barns, or even built into the walls of houses for insulation. These dung walls served double duty. They provided fuel for burning and insulation for warmth. In areas where winters were especially brutal, layering dried dung into the home structure made perfect sense. It was one of the few materials that could sit around the house for months without spoiling, and eventually keep you warm when the time came. The burning characteristics of dried dung were surprisingly good. When properly prepared, it produced very little smoke and burned at a steady temperature ideal for both cooking and heating. You could cook stews, bake bread, or just keep a room warm, all without needing huge quantities of fuel. Different animals produced dung with different burning qualities. Cow dung was considered the gold standard. Horse dung burned hotter and faster, but cows offered the best all-around performance, especially in terms of heat duration and cleaner burn. The economic advantages were substantial. Dung was free, renewable, and available year-round as long as you had livestock. You didn't need a forest, a saw, or a wagon to get it. Unlike wood, which required time and effort to cut and transport, dung literally delivered itself to your doorstep on a daily basis. Every animal provided a fresh supply of fuel, making it one of the most sustainable heating methods available. What others might have seen as waste, medieval peasants saw as warmth, and in the middle of winter, that was all that mattered. However, fuel wasn't the only way peasants used natural materials to stay warm. They also discovered that winter weather itself could provide excellent insulation. Medieval peasants figured out that the same snow that made their lives miserable could also be used to make their homes significantly warmer. For most of the year, snow was the enemy, blocking paths, freezing livestock troughs, and making it harder to get anything done. But once they realized what it could do for insulation, they started seeing it as a useful gift. They discovered that nature was basically delivering free insulation material right to their doorstep, whether they ordered it or not. Snow walls were built by packing fresh snow against the exterior walls of houses, creating additional layers of insulation that could make a dramatic difference in indoor temperatures. In many cases, the difference was enough to help families burn less firewood and still stay relatively warm inside. The technique was so effective that some families actually looked forward to heavy snowfalls, knowing that each storm was bringing them better home insulation. A thick snow wall didn't just block the wind, it acted like a thermal blanket wrapped around the house. The science behind snow insulation was solid, even though medieval peasants didn't understand the physics involved. Snow contains a high percentage of trapped air, which is an excellent insulator. These air pockets reduce heat transfer, making snow one of the few natural materials that can keep heat in and cold out at the same time. A properly constructed snow wall could reduce heat loss through walls by up to 50%, making it like adding an extra layer of medieval siding. That was no small improvement in an age where most homes were built of wood, wattle, and daub, or stone without any real insulation. Construction techniques were important for creating effective snow walls. It wasn't just a matter of shoveling snow up against the house and hoping for the best. The snow had to be packed firmly against the house, but not so tightly that it lost its insulating air pockets. Getting the density right required experience and practice. Too loose and it would crumble. Too packed and it lost its warmth-retaining properties. Over time, experienced families learned how to apply the snow in layers, pressing and shaping it just right. Different types of snow worked better for different applications. Fresh, powdery snow was excellent for insulation, but difficult to pack into stable walls. It had the most air, but the least cohesion. Slightly wet snow was easier to work with and held its shape better, though it was heavier. In some areas, people would wait for the perfect snow consistency before building their walls, similar to how modern builders wait for the right kind of cement mix. Maintenance was an ongoing concern throughout the winter. Snow didn't just sit there untouched. Wind and temperature changes could cause snow walls to settle or develop gaps that reduced their effectiveness. Animals could dig into them, or thawing and refreezing could lead to cracks. Still, families kept an eye on them, patching holes and repacking soft spots. The fuel savings alone made snow wall construction worth the effort. In a world where every log counted and warmth wasn't guaranteed, cutting down on heat loss was a survival tactic, not just a comfort measure. Some communities developed sophisticated snow management systems that involve multiple families working together to build and maintain insulation barriers. In especially harsh regions, neighbors would coordinate snowpacking days, reinforcing the walls of one home after another. It was both a social and practical effort, one that turned the season's biggest nuisance into a shared solution. Snow may have made their lives harder, but with a little effort, it also made their homes a little warmer. But staying warm required more than just clever insulation. Peasants also discovered that the byproducts of their heating fires could serve multiple practical purposes around the home. Medieval peasants never threw away wood ash after their fires burned out. They knew it was far too valuable to waste. They treated ash like medieval gold dust, except it was gray, messy, and had a habit of clinging to everything. When mixed with water, ash produced a substance called lye, a basic soap that was surprisingly effective for cleaning. This homemade cleanser worked for washing hands, dishes, and clothes, cutting through grease and grime far better than people might assume for something scooped out of a fireplace. Ash also played a big role in managing unpleasant smells. It was regularly sprinkled over food scraps, chamber pots, and latrines to mask odors and keep flies away. It acted like a medieval air freshener, one that didn't come in a fancy container, but actually worked even if it looked like someone had spilled their chimney. In the pantry, small amounts of ash were used to preserve grains. A thin dusting over stored food created an alkaline environment that insects hated, helping keep the family's grain supply safe without the need for expensive or unavailable pest control. During winter, ash found its way into basic medical care. People rubbed it on sore spots or minor wounds to help absorb moisture and prevent infection. It wasn't exactly comfortable. Ash probably stung on raw skin, but it often worked well enough to keep things from getting worse. Best of all, ash was free. It came with every fire and didn't require a trip to the market. Hardwood ash was especially valued for soap making due to its higher lye content, while softwood ash was preferred for general household use. Over time, smart families learned exactly which wood produced the most useful ash and made sure not a pinch went to waste. These medieval solutions prove that human creativity flourishes under pressure. Simple materials became powerful tools when ordinary people applied intelligence, patience, and determination to life's greatest challenges.